Welcome to the Moms I Know with Sheila Walsh-Denton and Maria Anderson-Farner. Two moms on a mission to reclaim childhood and take you from surviving to thriving on your parenting journey. The Moms I Know is your go-to source for motivation, inspiration, and resources, and real conversation about motherhood and parenting with intention. Thank you for being a part of our community. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Imbue thyself with the power of imagination. Have courage for the truth. Sharpen thy feeling for responsibility of soul. By Rudolf Steiner for teachers in Waldorf Education, and it's always meant a great deal to me.
Lovely. Welcome to the Moms I Know. Thank you so much, Susan, for being here with us and for that beautiful quote, which I really think speaks to our time of really strengthening that imagination. So we are so grateful to have you. Susan Goldstein was my daughter's teacher in the Santa Cruz Waldorf School from 1st through 8th grade, and we're just delighted to have you here today. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of your bio. That you graduated from Penn State University with a degree in education and started work in the public schools there, feeling that a little something was missing all along. And then when your own two children were born, they moved to Colorado, and there was a little Waldorf school there. And so Susan started teaching there and then got her Waldorf education from Rudolf Steiner College in California, in Sacramento, and then started her work at the Santa Cruz Waldorf School and took 3 complete classes through 1st through 8th grade, 3 rotations. So really an extraordinary accomplishment. And working as the assistant director of the Bay Area Center for Waldorf Teacher Training and the pedagogical director of the Santa Cruz Waldorf School, and teaching courses at Rudolf Steiner Public School Institute. And then also doing the Waldorf remedial education training, Waldorf mentoring training, and now being a private consultant for Waldorf schools around the United States. So Susan, such an impressive biography, and welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for all the work that you are doing.
Well, it's been really interesting to look at this whole notion of, conscious parenting as we started this podcast, and now after several seasons of recording, watching where education is going, and we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, and the outlook for education in the fall is a little bleak at this point. I know parents are really grappling with this whole idea of what are we going to do next. And I've always loved Waldorf education for my own children. With many of the families that I've mentored over the years, they have homeschooled their children with a Waldorf sort of inspiration. And then, of course, I've done a little bit of the Waldorf Foundation year myself. And so I think we have a lot of questions for you today around Waldorf education in general, and then also a little bit kind of going forward with families that might be choosing to send their children to the Waldorf schools, but with it being a little bit of an unknown, this idea of how do we get the mentoring if we want to bring it into more of our home life. So if that sounds good to you, we'll just kind of plunge in.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about those early years when you first discovered Waldorf education. And I had a very similar experience when I visited the Santa Cruz Waldorf School, and actually visited, you were teaching in a 6th grade classroom at that time. And I walked in, and within 5 minutes, I had this feeling that this is what education is supposed to look like in a classroom setting. And so, of course, that started my journey in terms of my own children. But then, of course, we also homeschooled along the way. And so it's been an interesting dance. But I want to hear a little bit about those years for you when you first discovered it, and then with your own children, and then pursuing the Waldorf teacher training.
Yes. Well, we moved to a very small rural area in western Colorado. There was a little Waldorf school in a former apple packing shed. Lamborn Valley School was called. And I went to visit it because I met some people when we moved there, and they said, oh, you used to be a teacher. You should go and visit this school. And I just walked in, and the environment, the warmth, the way that the children were held, I just thought, this is where I want my children to go to school. And this is what education should be like. And so I enrolled my children. They were young. They were in kindergarten, and one was still in preschool. And then they started their class training, their class grade training. And then my daughter's teacher was moving away. And they couldn't find another teacher. And at this point in Waldorf education in the United States, it was like 1980, 81. There were not very many Waldorf schools in the country. And so they knew that I was a teacher, and they asked me if I would take this class. And it was a combined 4th, 5th grade class, and I had been a public school 4th grade teacher. And so I said, okay. And I had a one-day teacher training from a very renowned Waldorf educator, Rene Carrito. He came and visited and helped me out. And so I had that class for 2 years. And it was very challenging but delightful at the same time. And when that class finished 6th grade, that was the highest grade the school went. And my life was changing, and so it was a good time for me to go to Sacramento and take the Waldorf teacher training. And so that's what I did. And I did my practicum, one of them at the Santa Cruz Waldorf School. And that's where I was offered a position. And so I thought, well, this would be a good place. I knew my children would like it in Santa Cruz. And so then I came.
So it's so much fun to hear your story and to see, the paths that our lives, that they take us on. So I wanted to ask, in this short little period of time that we have this morning, if you could give, for people that don't really know that much about Waldorf education, if you can give us a little bit of an overview of what is Waldorf education and how does it stand apart from other forms of education in a nutshell?
I know it's not easy, but I would say it's a very holistic form of education. And it really tries to educate what I would say would be the head, the heart, and the hands. So it's not just an intellectual academic approach, which of course it includes and is very rigorous, especially in the older grades. But it also works with the emotional life of the child, and it's a very hands-on approach. And so it's very well-rounded, and we acknowledge the importance of nature, the importance of the arts and music. And so it's a blending of all of the academic background that the children need, but it's also put into an approach that is developmentally appropriate for the different ages and for what children are going through in their own development.
I think that's the piece that really was so striking for me as I watched my children go through the different grades that they were in, is how much the curriculum resonated with them. And I had all sorts of questions, and I know you answered so many of my questions over the years, and I was probably one of those parents that was a little bit problematic. Well, what about this and what about that? But every time, I had the questions come up, I'd watch my children, and I would see this resonance with them, with the curriculum. And so I really appreciate you trying to encapsulate what it brings. And so, I always encourage people to research for themselves a little bit. If there were one or two books that you could recommend for parents, would there be something? I know one of the ones that I read was Teaching as a Lively Art. And that, for somebody outside of Waldorf education kind of looking in, that was helpful for me.
It's funny because somebody just asked me, so I have a list right here. One of them, I think, You Are Your Child's First Teacher. That's a good one. There's a book written by a good friend of mine, Steve Spitalny. It's called Conscious Parenting, and that's really good for parents of younger children. The 5 Golden Keys by Hella Heckman. And then if you really want to know in a very practical way about the curriculum, School as a Journey by Torrin Finzer. And one other thing I wanted to add, if I can, about another thing that makes Waldorf education unique is the fact that the teacher stays with the children for more than 1 year. And so, as you stated, I took 3 classes and I was their main teacher for 8 years for each class. Now, not every teacher does that. Many times there are teachers who will teach 1st through 4th grade, and then a different one will come in 5th through 8th. But the fact that the children really get to have a relationship with the teacher, and the teacher has a relationship with the child, is immensely helpful and really supportive.
I'd like to ask, kind of going back to the roots of Waldorf, just can you explain a little bit about Rudolf Steiner and how he came to develop Waldorf? Because it's interesting. So my story with Maria is that Maria was the one who kind of brought Waldorf to my family in a sense through our homeschooling. And so I feel like we were Waldorf influenced, definitely, but I've never been trained in Waldorf. However, I really like the part of the complete, looking at the complete child, the whole child, as well as, and I think maybe we can touch on this after this question, but is the piece where, like, reading, for example. I know a lot of, for me, for homeschooling, knowing that in Waldorf schools, they don't introduce reading until like age 7 or something like that. So that, I felt, gave us a little bit more space, even though you're developing, you're scaffolding in learning, but yet, do you know what I'm talking about?
So Rudolf Steiner started Waldorf education at the request of a man named Emil Molt, who owned, at the time in Stuttgart, Germany, the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory. And he came to Rudolf Steiner because he wanted to start a school for the children of his workers. And so Rudolf Steiner then began the Waldorf school. And the first Waldorf teachers had about a week, I think it was a week of training from Rudolf Steiner about what his picture was of what education in a really healthy way would look like. And so that was the beginning, and that was in 1919, so over 100 years ago. And the Waldorf education just blossomed from then on. And the first school started, it was very large. I think they had through 6th grade right in the very beginning because the cigarette factory was so huge. And so the movement has just continued to grow and flourish throughout the world at this point. And then over the years, the pressure from the outside academia or wherever we want to call it, on children being successful, as they would term it, what their definition of success is. And for some reason, that became associated with whether children could read and were literate. And they did not really continue to take into consideration age appropriateness and child development, because reading readiness is crucial. It's a foundation, just like any other huge skill. Learning to read develops skills, but also capacities. And so that is connected with a child's age. And all of the pressure from mainstream education for learning earlier and earlier to read, children can maybe learn that skill, but to have comprehension, to really be ready, that blocks other things from developing. And so everything in Waldorf early childhood education is reading readiness. Play is so important. Spending time in nature and listening to stories. The stories, the fairy tales, the nature stories that are told to the children have very, very complex vocabulary and beautiful images. And so the children really are developing that picture consciousness, and they're also listening to large vocabulary and understanding it because it means something to them, because there's that heart force that is activated. And also all of the physical things that we do in early childhood and in 1st grade in Waldorf, all of the movement, all of the activities that are not just the children think they're playing games and having fun, but it's all very, very intentional for developing different capacities so that when they are introduced to reading, which is in first grade, it's just not pressured in the same way, that then they are able to comprehend. And I always say that reading is like magic. It's like cracking a code or something. Because children can not read, and then one day all of a sudden they can read. Because they figured out the code of those funny looking letters, and that tells a story, and it's wonderful. And another thing that I think is very important in Waldorf education connected with reading is that we're not prone or required to do all of the testing that the state schools require, so that the children don't have scores in first grade or even in kindergarten that say, their level. But each teacher knows, and not every child is ready to learn to read at the same time. Some children come to first grade already knowing how to read, and that's fine. And some children won't read till second grade. I like to think of by the middle of third grade, children should be reading fluently. And if they're not, then there's some hindrance that they have that we need to work with and see what we can do to help them.
And both of my children were late. Well, they were all late readers. And I think, we look at this and this idea that there are other things going on. And I know the movement was a huge piece for both of my children, sort of that integrating of the left brain and the right brain. Yeah. This whole piece around reading, this is one of the things that we hear all the time. Oh, well, in Waldorf education, they don't teach reading. Well, it's like, we talk more about that reading readiness. There's also, there's other myths out there. So I'm wondering if you could speak to, a couple of those misconceptions or myths that people might have when they hear of Waldorf education and sort of,
do you want to be specific and ask me about a certain
Well, the reading one is a big one. A lot of times people have questions about Rudolf Steiner and this idea that Waldorf education is so Eurocentric. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
I think that is definitely living in some people. And I would say that right now, Waldorf education is worldwide. It is not just in Europe or the United States. Several years ago in China, for example, they started Waldorf schools, and now there's over, I think, 300 Waldorf schools in China. And just like that, within a few years, the Waldorf education exploded. In every continent, there are Waldorf schools. And the beauty, Rudolf Steiner himself said that every Waldorf school should be a reflection of its community. And so that in itself makes a doorway open for a school to be unique. And that to me is also part of the beauty of Waldorf education.
Lovely. And I've seen that so much in the curriculum being reflected differently in the different parts of the world. And so, when we have these fairy tales and folk tales and hero stories from around the world and how the individual schools have taken that and created that. And I also know that even at the Santa Cruz Waldorf School, that question came up when my children were there about diversity and inclusivity and a multicultural curriculum. And I think that was really addressed beautifully at the time. We also hear sometimes that Waldorf education is, when we're looking at all of these other focuses, that it may not be as academic. And I've always had to explain a little bit about it may be a more gentle beginning, but then it does get very rigorous. I'm wondering if you could speak to that just a little bit, especially at sort of the middle school and high school levels.
Yes, that's very true. That, again, it's our connection with the development of the child, age development of the child, readiness to what we feel is appropriate for how much academics that we do. And so, for example, you will not find homework in a first grade or a second grade classroom. And I can remember I always introduced homework in third grade. And it might be something that was always something that was connected with the curriculum, not just here's 20 pages of, of Xerox copies or do this workbook kind of a thing. It was always meaningful, something that the children could relate to. And in that way, they want to develop their academic skills. They love learning. And that is what has always been attractive to me about Waldorf education, is that the children do not stop loving learning. Even in the teenage years and the preteen years, when they're going through all kinds of hormonal changes, the curriculum is still connected to things that they will be interested in. And then you'll see, by high school, the students go, if they are wanting to, and that is their pathway, they do go to university, they do go to college. And so I think that a lot of the pressure that is sometimes put on Waldorf schools is that, again, external fear of my child won't be a success. And that's just not true.
And then there's also the question about computers and screen time that comes up, and a lot of misconceptions around that.
Yes, I think that, well, all you have to do is look on Facebook or Instagram and you see these toddlers with their phones nowadays. And there's a time for everything, a time and a purpose for everything. And so young children don't need to have all of that technology. And right now, that is probably one of the hardest things for parents to work with, because it's everywhere. And so in Waldorf education, it's not as if computers don't exist. Like with my last class, I actually brought in an expert to talk to them about internet safety, because these preteens were trying to get so many Facebook friends, and then they didn't know who their friends were. And so we try to teach them how to use technology, not to be used by technology in a certain way. And yes, I taught them, and we taught them how to look things up on the internet so that you could find valid resources for research projects in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade and things like that. But screen time is something that is really addictive. I don't think there's another word for it. And it has to be limited for young children in the best way that parents can do that. Spending time with your child, time in nature, taking a walk around the block, even in a city, things like that. So it's, again, a balance.
We've spoken about that often, this, kind of limiting of screen time and looking at it not as the bad guy, but that it's taking the place of all of these other healthy things that especially young children need to develop. And so I really appreciate the way you spoke to that, and that looking at it as a tool when the children are older. So, I want to ask a little bit about sort of the future of Waldorf education, and now being in this time of global pandemic, parents are very uncertain about whether schools will even be open in the fall. And that applies to public schools and private schools, Waldorf schools included. And so many, many families are looking at this idea of homeschooling, home education. And we've been getting a lot of questions about, if you want to have your children be at home in a Waldorf-inspired homeschool setting. So I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of sort of this as we go forward.
Well, I think you're right. The future is unknown, and it's changing all the time. I just read something about the Pajaro Valley School District had made a couple weeks ago a complete plan, and then the other day they changed that complete plan to now it's all remote learning. And so we have to be ready for change. And homeschooling is something that I know a lot of people are looking at as options. And I think that there are Waldorf homeschool manuals and things like that available. And there's also a need for people to have mentoring if a parent wants to be a homeschool parent, and that's completely understandable. But I think that for some families in this time of unknown where I think Santa Cruz County has said that children, if you're in a classroom, you have to wear a mask the entire time you're in the classroom. That's really hard for me to imagine a young child wearing a mask for 5 or 6 hours a day. And I think that I can totally have understanding of parents wanting to do some homeschooling where there's a lot less pressure on their children for the fear of being 6 feet apart and not touching somebody and all of that. So it's understandable.
So with this being such an unknown, I know that you already have started getting requests for mentoring, and Sheila and I are both talking to a lot of parents about how to go forward. And I was talking with a group of moms the other day about the fact that, every family around the world right now is grappling with this question, with this decision. And, different countries are going to have different ways of approaching this. And here in the United States, we're seeing the numbers going up. And so this is it's in everybody's thoughts right now. And so we want to give people some tools and resources. So I want to ask, before we go to, how people can get a hold of you, if there's anything else you want to speak to in the course of this conversation today around Waldorf education.
Well, I feel like Waldorf education for me has been the most beautiful form of education that I have ever heard about. And part of the beauty is that it's evolving. It's not something that's fixed from 100 years ago, and this is how we do it, and that's the end. Because it is taking into consideration what is happening in modern society, and every school will have to adapt, and every teacher really is trained to look at the children in the classroom and see who these children are and what do they need, and how can I serve them. And Waldorf education is about serving, and that's always what my life has been dedicated to, is service. And I think that I really have found that Waldorf education resounds with that belief that we're here to serve, and so that's what I think is very profound about it.
That's a lovely message for parents going forth, because as we are their parents, and so we are knowing our children so well, and so whether we're the parent or the teacher, we can be looking at what those children need. And I think both Sheila and I have really addressed that with the families that we worked with, and looking at each child individually. And so now, if home education is something that's going to be happening, what is going to be the best way that your child will learn, and how can we bring education? And so I think, Rudolf Steiner was brilliant in so many of his, he was not just talking about education, but agriculture and architecture and healthcare. Just amazing facets. And so for people to educate themselves more about this, and then to make these decisions, these conscious decisions based on the children that are right there in their family. So we really appreciate everything that you've shared.
One final thing I would like to say, and that is, I think the most important thing that parents can do is to make their children feel safe. To really not show them fear or speak in a way that will have them be afraid, to really be reassuring and to have their children know that they are loved and they are taken care of and they are safe.
Beautiful. Thank you. Sheila, do you have any other questions?
No, just thank you for, really kind of diving into Waldorf. And I just really want to share that when I think of Waldorf, I just think of beauty. Like when you go into a Waldorf classroom, I don't know if Maria stated it, but it's just that it was emphasis on the beauty. There was fresh flowers in the vase. There was always an illustration on the board. And I just think you're right. Like, what a perfect educational model to really support the whole child, especially during these times, to really protect childhood. I think it's really important.
Yeah. So, Susan, if people want to get a hold of you, what is the best way for them to do that?
They can email me. My email is Susan Goldstein at Yahoo. So that would be SUSGOLDSTEIN at yahoo.com.
Great. And we will include all of those resources in the show notes. And so we just so appreciate you being with us here today. And, you know, for me, because we did a combination, we did years of homeschooling and our children were also at the Waldorf school and they also did some public school and they did independent study and study abroad. People used to say, you know, well, wait a minute, but looking at each individual child and what they needed at that time, and then their own, as they got older, their own desires and impulses. I mean, the study abroad certainly came from both of them. And so it's been really interesting to watch and now seeing these grown children and then also working with families who chose to homeschool their children in a very Waldorf-inspired way and seeing how beautifully that can be done as well. So we just really encourage all of our listeners to explore the options that are out there and to look into Waldorf education. And Susan, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you both for all the work that you are doing. It's very important.
Thank you. Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today for the Moms I Know. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To get the show notes and resources mentioned in today's episode, visit themomsiknow.com. For information on Maria's programs, visit thefutureoffamily.com. And for information on Sheila's programs, visit purplebeetfamily.com. Don't forget to subscribe and rate us on iTunes and follow us on Instagram at The Moms I Know Podcast. Until next time, have a joyful family journey.